Please make welcome to North Troy, Chris Hedges.
Thanks. The last three books that I wrote, Death of the Liberal Class, which was kind of the breakdown of the pillars of the liberal establishment that once made incremental and piecemeal reform possible in our capitalist democracy. What happened? Why did they break down? And it goes all the way back to World War I. And I was just talking with somebody here about Dwight MacDonald, a writer I like very much. He's not read very much anymore. He was the influence on Chomsky. He published for 5 years till his money ran out a magazine called Politics that a young Noam Chomsky read. Never had a circulation above 5,000. But he was publishing Bruno Bettelheim, Hannah Arendt, George Orwell. And he's an amazing writer. He's also a beautiful writer. He was briefly a member of the Trotskyite Party, until Trotsky threw him out. He actually mailed a letter from Mexico to the Trotskyite Party in New York and said, everybody has a right to their own stupidities, but Comrade MacDonald abuses the privilege. He didn't belong, he wasn't a party person, I'm not either. But he writes at the end about the end of World War I as ushering into this, a period he calls the psychosis of permanent war, and I think it's a kind of brilliant insight. And he said none of the political theorists, including Marx, grappled with this phenomena of the psychosis of permanent war, where you're constantly ferreting out internal enemies in the name of anti-communism, which has destroyed all of the populist and radical movements in this country. And we stand now on the cusp of a very frightening corporate totalitarianism, which has garnered for itself tools of control that no other totalitarian state has ever amassed. And I covered the Stasi, the collapse of the Stasi state in East Germany. And it is precisely those movements, the old Wobblies, the old CIO, the old Communist Party, which we've erased from our history. And remember, in the early 20th century, if you were an African American, the only party that you could join where you were treated as an equal was the Communist Party, which is why Paul Robeson was a member of the Communist Party. And then I wrote a book, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. Totalitarian societies are always image-based, spectacle-based societies. And I used popular culture, of which I know nothing. I don't have a TV, I don't tweet, I don't have a Facebook page, I don't have a web page. I try and read every night. I just finished reading the Gulag Archipelago, all 3 volumes, which is amazing. And I have another friend of mine who actually reads more than I do, and I was trying to impress him and told him that I was going to now read Gibbon's Decline and Fall, which I've never finished. So, of course, he's already read that. And that severance from a print-based culture, what it does, which just is anti-thought. It destroys the capacity for thought, and has rendered most of our society illiterate, not stupid, but illiterate in the sense that they're not grounded in print, which is very dangerous because that's where ideas come. You cannot understand capital if you haven't read Marx's first volume on capital. You can't understand the configurations of power if you haven't read people like Sheldon Wolin, Democracy Incorporated, which is a book I never tire of slogging, but it's a very important book. I did a 7-part interview with Wolin, who's 92, I think. And he's not been interviewed in a long time. In the 80s, he's a beautiful writer, and certainly I think our greatest living political philosopher. His book, Politics and Vision, is a masterpiece. So he was living out in a retirement home outside of Portland, Oregon, about an hour outside of Portland. And he in the 80s, he had kind of called out neoliberalism for what it was, which was a con game, and been pushed He'd been writing for the New York Review of Books, he'd been completely pushed out of the mainstream, became a pariah even within the politics department at Princeton University where he was teaching. And so I went out with a film crew to do it. So you can watch it on YouTube. It's worth watching. But we had no idea. I mean, I don't think he'd been given an interview in a decade or so. And the film crew went in and he said, well, you can set up in the study, you'll see a big white dog in there. And they went to set the camera up and there was a small white cat. And they were very worried. But as you can see, the dog was actually having a walk with the house sitter, so there was a big white dog. But as you can see, I went to that interview totally prepared, and I could barely keep up with this guy. It's really stunning, and I just did not dumb it down. I tried to keep it at the brilliant intellectual level that only a person like Professor Wolin is capable of. But he uses this term inverted totalitarianism, which I think is correct, that we live in a system that's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That you have the facade of electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally, corporate forces have seized all of the levers of power, including the systems of information, to render the citizen impotent. And that book was never reviewed by any mainstream publication, not one. And yet it was given to me by Ralph Nader, who, man, I admire deeply. I helped him write his major policy speeches in 2008, it wasn't a popular time to be going around the country trashing Barack Obama and calling on people to vote for Ralph, although I bet a lot of people regret it now. I was at the University, I think, of Wisconsin, and some students said, well, yeah, we like Nader, he's nice, but his speeches are so boring. But it was Nader who gave me the book, as he gives me so many books. Nobody has fought corporate power longer or with more integrity or courage or more effectively in this country than Ralph Nader. And he truly is one of the great, great, great Americans. And I cherish the friendship that I have with him. I admire him deeply and have learned a tremendous amount from him. But I wrote about spectacle, and I went to professional wrestling at Madison Square Garden, and my longest chapter is on the porn industry. We're a completely pornified society. Reality television, because the values of corporate capitalism are disseminated through popular culture. So if you watch a reality television show, what are the characteristics that it celebrates? It celebrates manipulation, aggressiveness, deception, the primacy of the self over others as opposed to self-sacrifice and community, and in the end you get money and fleeting fame. These values are just inculcated now at every level. One of the things that was so surprising to me about, I'd not been to professional wrestling before, was how emotional the crowds were. People were weeping, and yet I think on a certain level they knew it was fictitious or staged, but the storylines very cleverly dovetailed with their own experiences. So you had, for instance, a wrestler who was wearing an orange jumpsuit and had PTSD and had come out of prison, and as some of you may know, I teach in a prison and have for many years, and he was wrestling the corrections officer who had abused him, who would come out dressed like a CO. I mean, this kind of stuff. Then my last book was Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which I did with the cartoonist Joe Sacco, who I think is one of the most brilliant artists and cultural and political critics in America. His book, Footnotes on Gaza, is a masterpiece, certainly one of the greatest books done on the Palestine-Israel conflict. And we went into the poorest pockets of the United States. Literally the poorest. So Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the country at the time, was also the most dangerous. Pine Ridge, South Dakota, where the average life expectancy for a male is 48. That is the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. At any one time on Pine Ridge, 60% of the residents, some of whom live in sod huts, have neither electricity or running water. We went to southern West Virginia, where we are destroying the Appalachian Mountains because they don't want to dig down for coal seams, so they're blowing the top 400 feet off the mountains, huge billion-gallon impoundment ponds filled with heavy metals. The air is fetid, the water is toxic. People are having their gallbladders removed. Cancer is an epidemic. You go into the elementary schools. In the nurse's office, there are just rows of little inhalers because the children can't breathe. That's what unfettered, unregulated capitalism does. And we went to these sacrifice zones, the produce fields in Florida, where you find periodically instances of slavery. These are Central Americans or Mexicans who are being held against their will behind barbed wire. We interviewed a guy who had been chained with other workers every night in a truck to say we've all become one big sacrifice zone. And it is incumbent upon you to look at what's happening in these sacrifice zones because we're next. And, Troy, New York is a sacrifice zone. But we're all sacrifice zones because unfettered, unregulated capitalism, as Karl Marx understood, is a revolutionary force. It does not have built within it any internal limits. The external limits are gone. It will do what unfettered capitalism always does, which is exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And that's why the environmental crisis is twinned with the economic crisis. So every new report from climate change scientists, and we just went through the month of March, where every single day, in terms of carbon emissions, was above 400 parts per million. That's the first time since we've recorded weather that's happened. This year will be is on record. It looks like it will become the hottest in human history, at least since we recorded weather. All of the recent reports that scientists are giving us about the Arctic ice, that the old ice layers of melt are gone, and these are new layers, which is a whole different kind of configuration. And the response of global capital is to race up there as fast as they can and drop $500 million drill bits down in the Arctic Sea to profit off the death throes of the planet. That's where we live, and that they're talking now about the ice, the summer ice, being completely gone by 2020. And what that will do to crop yields and weather patterns. We're already seeing the migrations, the droughts in California. And yet we remain passive in front of our electronic hallucinations, which is just how they want us to remain. We don't react to what is now the greatest existential crisis that the human species has ever faced. And this book is different from the others in that it's not diagnostic anymore of the problem, but begins from the belief that the systems that once made reform possible no longer work, and that we are barreling towards catastrophe, and that if we don't rise up and revolt, if we don't build movements of mass civil disobedience, then we will have to begin to contemplate the extinction of not only other species, but finally our own species. And it's a look at what it takes to rebel. What is it that triggers revolt, and what does the state do when you do revolt? And I spend a lot of time in the book speaking with figures that I admire who have risen up and paid the price. Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. We were at Cornell West and I would drive down. Cornell doesn't like to take public transportation, not surprisingly, since everybody recognizes Cornell. And we have lunch in New York, and 10 people come up, and so we would get up at 3 in the morning and drive down to Fort Meade for the Chelsea Manning trial. And Cornell, who's certainly, I would say, along with Susan Sontag and Noam Chomsky, I would rank him with probably the 3 smartest people I've ever met, who knows everything about everything, also knows everything about classic soul. And so we would drive down listening to classic soul, and he knew the backstory of every single, he'd go, Bootsy Collins wrote that song for James Brown when he was 19. It was like, I've had that experience both with that I've had with Cornell, that I've had with both with Chomsky and with Susan, where in kind of intellectual frustration, I would try and steer them into an area where I thought I might be able to hold my own, you know. I once did that with Susan Sontag on theology. Now I have a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School, and surely I thought I could teach Susan Sontag a thing or two. And of course I just was decimated. And then I could see her feeling kind of sorry for me and saying, well, I don't tell this to a lot of people, but after I finished my PhD at Harvard, when I think she was like 21 or something, I actually taught religion at Columbia for a little while, so it was kind of making me. I had dinner once with Chomsky on the Middle East, and I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the Middle East, and Chomsky's reeling off dates and names, and I was there, and I covered it. I didn't remember. And the same with Cornell. One night, we had dinner a little while ago, and we got into a huge debate as to whether Chekhov or Dostoevsky was a greater writer. That occupied our entire. I mean, I took Dostoevsky, he took Chekhov, although I do think he's wrong on that one. But one night I had done at Harvard, in addition to my divinity degree, a year of classics and a year of English, mostly Shakespeare. And I remember one night getting Cornell off on Shakespeare, and he was making one kind of brilliant point after another, and I surreptitiously was trying to take notes under the table until I finally just gave up and put it on the. But we'd go into Fort Meade, and you weren't allowed to get into the trial. They only let 27 people into that courtroom, but we'd show up, and all the MPs would recognize Cornell, and they never even checked our IDs. I mean, we just came in. So the huge crowds of people are waiting outside Fort Meade, and it's like 8 in the morning. Cornell and I are driving around looking for the Burger King to get a coffee. We were always the first 2 people in line for the court. And I got a letter from Chelsea Manning after she was sent to Leavenworth. She wasn't allowed to turn around. She had to keep, and she wrote me a letter and said, when she was sentenced, she said, I saw out of the corner of my eye you and Dr. West, and I want to thank you for being there. And I used to kind of complain to Cornell because it's 3 in the morning, and Cornell says, no, we have to go because we're going to be the only 2 public intellectuals there. It's our duty to be there. Cornell is certainly one of the people I admire most, who's wedded his incredible brilliance to a passionate championing of the marginalized, which for me is what it means to be an intellectual, rather than building a monument to yourself, which is what most intellectuals do. That's the Julian Benda school, where Treason of the Intellectuals, written in the 1920s, he said you have a choice between serving privilege and power or justice and truth. Those are your 2 choices, and the more you compromise with those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. Cornell and Noam, and they've never diminished that capacity. Cornell's in the book, but I talked to Mumia Abu-Jamal, a great revolutionary, Jeremy Hammond. I interview a lot of interviews in jail. Julian, of course, in the embassy, the great civil rights attorney Lynn Stewart, to kind of look at what it takes to rebel and what the state does. Now, the state understands very well what's happening, and they're preparing. They, have not only put in physical mechanisms such as militarizing police forces, security, wholesale security and surveillance. We're the most photographed, monitored, eavesdropped, watched population in human history. And when your government watches you 24 hours a day, you can no longer use the word liberty. That is the relationship between a master and a slave. They have run scenario after scenario in terms of the effects of climate change, the effects of the breakdown of global capitalism, which, as Karl Marx understood, is not sustainable ultimately. You can't keep expanding. There isn't limitless expansion. And what happens, as Marx grasped in the later stages of capitalism, is that in order to keep generating the profits, capital cannibalizes the very structures that sustains it. So that's how you get big banks looting the US Treasury. That's how you get the fossil fuel industry, which worldwide has subsidies of $5.4 billion. Maybe it's trillion. I don't know. It's a lot. In the name of austerity, your physical infrastructure decays, and I just got a nice taste of that on Amtrak. It's not the first time on Amtrak. Schools are closed, libraries are shuttered, and you have this giant military machine building. The House just passed an appropriations bill so we can build, I think it's 12 new Ohio-class submarines at a cost of $8 billion apiece. And they tell us that, we're in the age of the war on terror. I don't think ISIS even owns a rowboat, as far as I know. But it doesn't matter, of course. $345 billion to renovate our nuclear warheads. There's a good idea. And that's how empires go down. So what happens is you hollow empires out from the inside. And then to maintain control, you use the mechanisms of coercion and violence that are very familiar on the outer reaches of empire, where I spent 20 years as a foreign correspondent, and you bring them back into the heart of empire. So a night raid in Oakland, California, for a non-violent drug warrant, let's say, will entail militarized police units with long-barreled weapons, wearing Kevlar body armor, with maybe a command helicopter with a searchlight kicking down the door at 2 in the morning, of course terrorizing everybody in the apartment. It doesn't look any different from a night raid in Fallujah. It's exactly the same. And so increasingly empire uses the mechanisms that it uses to hold captive populations hostage in places like Iraq or Afghanistan to hold its own population hostage. And what we've seen is a rewriting of the Constitution by judicial fiat to accompany the physical mechanisms by which the state intends to keep us under its heel. And that's how you get this absurd notion, courtesy of Citizens United, that unlimited corporate cash is the right to petition the government, or free speech. That's how you get an completely a misinterpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the executive branch the right to order the targeted assassinations of US citizens. Now, it doesn't matter what these people did. Once you set that precedent, you're finished. Because once the state accrues to itself that kind of power, when the state feels threatened, it will use it. And the person who kind of helped me understand that process was Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism. So Arendt gets out of the University of Heidelberg. We'll forgive her for her relationship with Heidegger. And she writes in one of her essays that she had to unlearn everything that she had been taught at the university to become a moral human being. And she was not a Zionist, and she was quite, in 1950, was writing quite critically of Israel, in the sense that she said that, the the wrongs that were committed against Jews are not justified by committing wrongs against Palestinians. But she wants to engage in some kind of a movement that is fighting back against fascism, and so she works with a Zionist group that is trying to smuggle German Jews to Palestine until she's picked up by the Gestapo, and she almost doesn't make it out. It was quite serious. And she's stripped of her passport, stripped of her citizenship, ends up in France, stateless. And she writes about that quality of being stateless. And if you walk out this door, you probably don't have to walk very far to find stateless human beings, undocumented workers who are suffering exactly what she suffered, stripped of all rights as citizens, all protection. Essentially, you can't even call them second-class citizens because they have no rights at all, virtually. And she said that as soon as a society creates a group of people who are stateless, who have no rights, it does two things. It builds a legal mechanism by which everyone in the society can be stripped of their rights. And it builds a physical mechanism which she calls omnipotent policing. And she said those two elements become toxic at a moment of disintegration, because while they may be confined, as they are in depressed communities like Troy in the name of drug laws, where police essentially can act with utter impunity, and we are watching now, every 28 hours, an African American in this country is being murdered, man or woman, often children, unarmed. I mean, we have it on film. I mean, think about it. We have film of police officers murdering unarmed citizens, choking them to death, shooting them in the back, and yet the state doesn't respond. And this, of course, is extremely dangerous. And I'll talk a little bit about that notion of paralysis. But Arendt said that omnipotent policing, coupled with that legal mechanism, means that it's almost with a flick of a switch, if the society begins to unravel, that can just become pervasive throughout the entire society. So we've watched our own legal system devolve. The fact that our court system takes such black and white issues as wholesale surveillance and refuses to outlaw it. And don't be fooled by the refusal to extend the Patriot Act, by the way. They're still in business. Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. And as some of you may know, I sued Barack Obama in federal court over Section 1021. Section 1021 allows the U.S. military, overturning over 150 years of domestic law, to seize American citizens who substantially support. Now, that's not material support. That's not a legal term. That's open to very broad legal interpretation. Substantially support al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces, another nebulous term. Strip them of due process and hold them indefinitely in military facilities, including our offshore penal colonies, our black sites. When Judge Catherine Forrest ruled in our favor and issued a temporary injunction, which was amazing given the history of the court since 9/11. It was fascinating to watch the response of the Obama administration. And let's be clear, Obama's assault on civil liberties is far worse than the assault on civil liberties under George Bush. And we haven't even gotten into the use of the Espionage Act to Kiriakou, Sterling, all of these figures who have stood up to expose criminal activity, Chelsea Manning, inside our government. And those who have committed fraud and abuse and criminal acts remain unpunished, and those who expose those acts are often sitting in prison, or in the case of Edward Snowden, in exile. So the Obama administration sent not just federal attorneys, but attorneys for the NSA, the intelligence communities, and demanded in the name of national security that section of the act be reinstituted until the appeal could be heard by the Second Circuit. And Judge Forrest, to her credit, refused to do it. And I have to say, in the degradation of media, and it's been pretty pronounced. The one journalistic entity that covered the trial and wrote about it well was my old employer, the New York Times, and wrote an editorial praising Judge Forrest's decision. And her opinion, which is worth reading, she says that this law opens the way for the government to criminalize not just a person, but an entire group of people. And she brings up the internment of 110,000 Japanese during World War II. So I think that was on a Friday. Monday morning, the government attorneys go to the Second Circuit and demand that the law be put back into effect, which in the name of national security, everything's in the name of national security, which they do. And the lawyers, Bruce Afron and Carl Mayer and I wondered why. Why were they so aggressive? And I think our feeling was that the reason is because they're already using the law. That most likely there are Pakistani U.S. dual nationals in places like Bagram. And if they could get out and get legal redress, then the government, if that law had been allowed to stand, would be in contempt of court. Now, what happened there is a kind of classic example of how the courts have been used to strip us of our constitutional rights by reinterpreting them. So here you have a clear violation of constitutional law, the use of the military to stand on the streets of American cities and, in essence, carry out acts of extraordinary rendition against American citizens. And lest you think that this is some kind of wild interpretation, this lawsuit lasted 2 years, we contacted the Democratic leadership, Pelosi's office, and we said, look, all you have to do is insert into that section that it does not apply to U.S. citizens and we'll drop the suit. But of course they didn't do it because it was designed for U.S. citizens. And I was also a plaintiff before the Supreme Court. I teach in a prison, I think I mentioned, and everybody in a prison has about 3 names. And so when my students all found out that I was involved in all these cases, my name in the prison became LS for lawsuit. So LS was my street name. So I'd been involved in Clapper versus I was a plaintiff in Clapper versus Amnesty International, where this was before the Snowden revelations, we had challenged the FISA Amendment Act, the wholesale surveillance and wiretapping. And government lawyers, it got to the Supreme Court, and government lawyers got up and said, first of all, it's pure speculation that there's any kind of surveillance. And then, piling it on, they added that if I or any of the other plaintiffs were being watched, the government would tell us. The Supreme Court bought it and threw the case out, said we didn't have standing. So that's what happened. The Second Circuit had waited months. The case was called Hedges versus Obama. And waited months to rule, waited months. And finally, after the Supreme Court ruling on Clapper versus Amnesty International, they said, oh, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama, and they threw the case out, and it's law. This gets right back to what Arendt nailed, that when they create physical mechanisms of oppression and they create legal mechanisms of oppression, it's by design. And any government that accrues to itself that kind of power will use it. I think that there's, we're probably living in a period Antonio Gramsci defined as an interregnum, this period where we know something's wrong. There's a kind of angst, across the political spectrum. So when they ran polls on the NDAA, it had a 97% disapproval rating, but it passed anyway. In the same way that the bailouts, when the bailouts were being proposed for the big banks, the speculators, remember in the 17th century in Europe, speculators were hung. Now they run the government and the political system. Constituent calls were 100 to 1 against the bailouts, but it passed anyway. It doesn't matter what we want. Hillary Clinton, I hope none of you are fooled anymore by the Clintons, is running a campaign where she's going to sound like, Eugene Debs. But all you have to do is go back and look at 2008. They run focus group and poll. They know what we want to hear. And they even know how to package it in a way that we want to hear it. But once power, once this kind of corrupt political class takes power, they serve the centers of power, which isn't us. And if they don't serve those centers of power, they won't be there. In some ways, I'm angrier at Barack Obama than I am at George W. Bush, as venal as I find Bush, because Bush was an idiot. I don't think Bush understood very much. Barack Obama understands everything. He's extremely intelligent. I think there's a level of cynicism on the part of Obama that I find quite disturbing. And it's very clear that he's going to walk out of the White House like the Clintons and amass for himself tens of millions of dollars from the masters that he has served. I just spoke to some young Ferguson activists who were really impressive. One a hip-hop artist named T. Dubbo, 27, and a young woman, I think she's 21. So after the Ferguson unrest, they invited T. Dubbo. Obama invited a small group of Ferguson activists, including T. Dubbo, to the White House, and he told me that Obama asked him if he'd voted for him. And T. Dubbo's answer was no. You haven't done anything for black people. Voting for you because you were black would be shallow. Now, there was a level of political sophistication that the liberal class in America didn't get at all. The whole idea that gender or personality and all of these political personalities are manufactured is how we should choose our leaders as anti-politics. There's nothing to do with politics. And I think that there's, this, as I said, this interregnum, this moment when people know something's wrong, they don't trust the leadership. I think Congress has an approval rating of about 7%. But they don't quite know what to do. They haven't articulated another vision. But there's that kind of angst. Alexander Berkman has an essay called The Invisible Revolution, where he talks about how there's this period where the old ideas lose their potency, their efficacy, and so that all of the superstructure, both the ideological and the physical superstructure, appears to be intact. But underneath it, the ideas that sustain it no longer have their hold on the popular imagination. And yet, we haven't yet articulated a response. And he likens that invisible revolution to a water pot that's boiling. You don't see it until the steam suddenly arises. And I think that's where we are. I think that we are at a moment when, sometimes I give talks, and I'm no friend of the libertarians. I'm not, obviously, you know what I think of the Christian right. I wrote a book once called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. And yet I will sometimes pull people from this radical right who are dealing with the same kinds of anxieties and fears and frustrations. Unfortunately, they are channeling what I think is a legitimate anger into a proto-fascist movement. Fascist or proto-fascist movements, rather than directing that anger where it should be, direct it towards the vulnerable, Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists. And that's a very powerful undercurrent in American society. And I have a chapter in the book called Vigilante Violence. And there's a quote from a really powerful essay. It was the last thing Richard Hofstadter wrote in the introduction to his book on violence. But it is, as almost everything Hofstadter wrote, brilliant. But he talks about how, we have all these weapons. We are, the most weaponized population, probably, certainly within the industrialized world. But Americans don't have a tradition of turning those weapons against the government. It is primarily white vigilante violence that's turned against the weak and the vulnerable, going all the way back to the slave patrols, to the reign of terror that African Americans endure. I mean, what is it that is happening on the streets of Ferguson and Baltimore but a lynching? The labor wars. America had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered by vigilante groups, Pinkertons, Baldwin Felts, gun thugs. Even if you look at the wars of westward expansion, many of the worst massacres were carried out by rogue vigilante groups like Covington out of Denver, who carried out the Sand Creek Massacre, where Black Kettle and all of his tribe were killed. That's always been a long tradition in American society, and it remains current, and you see it in the Tea Party, the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party. Maybe they're all lunatics. I mean, we do have to hand it to Bill Clinton. He turned the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and he drove the Republican Party so far to the right, it became insane. But those groups are powerful, and I lived in France. The Democratic Party in Europe would be a far-right party. And, this is part of my problem with Bernie running. He should run, but as an independent, because the Democrats are part of the problem. Unfortunately, he's not going to get into the debates unless he promises to endorse the candidate. I mean, this whole specter of Hillary Clinton wandering around like Queen Elizabeth and refusing to talk to the press, and all these journalists begging her. You remember she went to Chipotle, and for like weeks it was like, what did she order on her sandwich or something? She's going to raise $2.5 billion but of course she has to raise that kind of money because in these campaigns, it's the only thing they have to sell you is fear. If you're on the right wing, it's fear that, there'll be an abortion clinic opened in your Baptist church and homosexuals will take over your kindergarten. And if you're on the left wing, it's, the fear that, all the yahoos will descend on, but it's fear. I mean, they don't really offer, the superstructure remains completely the same, whether it's on Wall Street, security and surveillance, imperial war, there is no difference. I mean, or as Freud said, it's the narcissism of minor difference. And the whole kind of fictitious figures that they use in terms of masking unemployment, which are probably well known to all of you. I mean, all of this is creating a very explosive moment. Now, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I covered both of the Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic. And the thing about that kind of cauldron of discontent is that as a reporter, you know it's there, but you never know what will ignite it. And what ignites it is often something relatively banal. The problem is that when you live in a state that has been seized by a tiny cabal of oligarchs or tyrants, which removes itself from day-to-day reality. I mean, remember, these people, they have no concept of what our lives are like, the people who have absolute power. They never ride on commercial airlines. They're certainly not stuck on Amtrak somewhere. They live in, I think a writer in New Yorker called it Richistan. And they live in this false kind of bubble. I mean, these people commute to work in helicopters. And so they replicate what all dying elites do, the Versailles or the Forbidden City. and they make decisions based no longer on reality, but their bizarre perception of reality, which is that why do we want public health? Because everybody can go to an emergency room. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this kind of stuff. And so they can't respond as the crisis within the country deepens. So if you look at the Occupy movement, and I spent a good bit of time in Zuccotti, there you had the mostly white, college-educated sons and daughters of the middle class, crippled by debt, massive debt. My older son, did his graduate degree in Paris, in France, and I said, if you walked around French universities and told French students they had to pay $50,000 a year to get an education, they would shut the damn country down. They got out into the wider society and they found there was no place for them. They suffered, or it was tepid compared to Ferguson or Baltimore, but they suffered from mistreatment by the police. And that was a crucial moment on a couple levels. One, that class constitutes what Bakunin calls déclassé intellectuals. And Bakunin and Marx, who hated each other, and Bakunin was wrong on a lot, but he wasn't wrong on that, in that Marx didn't see those déclassé intellectuals as important. Bakunin said they're vital for revolt. And I think he's right. It's the tinder of the déclassé intellectuals who walked out into the unemployed journalists, the unemployed lawyers, the unemployed teachers, who walk out into the wider society. I mean, look at our professors. 35% of professorships are now tenure track, and you can be pretty certain that all the people who have those tenure tracks are building robotics for the Defense Department. They're not teaching classics. Anything that has to do with the capacity to teach you how to think rather than what to think, that is part of the assault on the arts, is wiped out in any totalitarian society, and ours is no exception. So those déclassé intellectuals become a vital kind of tinder, and exposed, I think, the failure of the liberal class, especially the white liberal class, who, while the poor and the working class were being stripped of their jobs, evicted from their homes, suffering indiscriminate police brutality, were busying themselves with multiculturalism and identity politics, which in the eyes of corporations just create more consumers, and forgot the primacy of justice. And the response of the state is key, in the sense that when you have an ossified state, or a state that is controlled by a narrow, oligarchic, in this sense, global corporate elite, it cannot respond rationally. So all of the demands, and we're talking about a nonviolent, mostly middle-class movement, sons and daughters of the middle class, asking for work, asking for a rational healthcare system, i.e., the public option or universal health care for all, asking that we respond to the destruction of the ecosystem on which we depend for life by the fossil fuel industry, and let me not forget the animal agriculture industry. The response of a state that no longer has any connection with its populace is to attempt to physically eradicate the movement, and that's precisely what happened. And the longer that goes on, the more dangerous the situation becomes. So you have African American men and women marching through the streets of cities where they have been terrorized now with indiscriminate, lethal force used randomly by militarized police, and the state is deaf. Films of people being murdered circulate through the entire country. Films of people being choked to death. And the state doesn't respond. And what happens when the state refuses to respond and attempts essentially to crush. Remember, we had tanks. We had tanks on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, against unarmed protesters who were asking their city police to stop killing them. When the state uses all of the mechanisms at its disposal to shut down legitimate dissent, then it drives that dissent underground and it makes it more radical. And I'm sure you've been watching, as I have in the last month, 2 police officers shot dead in Mississippi, a police officer shot dead in New York, and we just had, was it 2 police officers who were shot? I'm hoping that these are isolated incidents. But I know from covering disintegrating societies that the longer the state refuses to react, the longer the state refuses to react rationally to legitimate grievances by the citizenry, the longer the state uses the mechanisms of control to shut down legitimate dissent, the more they create the very anarchy, which in many ways they want. Because the only language discredited states or totalitarian systems can speak better than we can is violence. And I, spent many years abroad, and I've seen what they can do. 60,000 special forces, members of our special forces, and let's be clear, these are death squads. And you saw it from the murder of Osama bin Laden. I covered war for 20 years, and if someone's unarmed, even if they're Osama bin Laden, you're not allowed to shoot them. And they have the capacity to bring all of those forces back. I mean, they already are. 80%, we have 16 intelligence agencies, and 80% of that intelligence is now done by private corporations. There's a complete fusion of corporate and state power on every level, including the levels of intelligence and on the levels of military force, including the rise, of course, of mercenary forces itself. I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We were surrounded by trenches. The besieged city had built trenches, 3.5 years. We were being shelled by the Serbs, up to 2,000 shells a day, 155 howitzers, 90 millimeter tank rounds. This was not small stuff. Katyusha rockets, constant sniper fire. We knew that if the Serbs broke through that trench system, 1/3 of the city would be slaughtered, and the rest would be driven into displacement and refugee camps. We knew that from what they'd done in the Drina Valley, what they'd done in Vukovar. It wasn't supposition. And at that point, when you face the possibility of your own annihilation, it's perfectly understandable that you would use violence to defend yourself. But it doesn't save you from the poison of violence. And once movements of resistance and movements of power begin to speak to each other through violence, then I would posit that almost everyone, probably everyone in this room, including myself, is out of the equation. Because those who rise up in moments of extremity have access to weapons and a penchant for violence. And they use those mechanisms to control their own. That's why revolutionary movements that use violence consume each other, in the way that Lenin destroyed the Soviets, destroyed the Mensheviks. And that's why, coming out of 20 years of war, I'm so fervently nonviolent. But I'm not naive about where we are. We have no time left. Climate change alone. I have 4 children. And where's the guy? We were arrested together. Somebody here in front of the White House. I don't like going to jail. I mean, going to jail is more time than I care to donate to my government. But I'm out because even if I fail, I want my children to say that their dad tried. And I think we have, I speak of my generation, stolen the future of the next generation and succeeding generations, and it's morally incumbent upon us to put our bodies on the line. And there's really no excuse left. And there's no time left. And that means sustained acts of mass civil disobedience that discredit the state. And I talk in Wages of Rebellion about the great revolutionary theorists, Crane Britton and Davies, and they make the key point that no system is overthrown until the mechanisms of internal security defect, or at least large sections of them. And I think in that sense, revolutions are fundamentally nonviolent. So when the Cossacks go in to break up the bread riots in Petrograd, and they refuse to shoot the rioters and begin to fraternize with the crowd, the Tsar is finished. He doesn't even make it back to Petrograd. He has to abdicate it on a railway siding. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. And in the September of 1989, Erich Honecker, the communist dictator who had been in power for almost 19 years, sends out an elite paratroop division to Leipzig to fire on the crowd. That paratroop division refuses to fire on the crowd. Honecker doesn't last another week in power. The same thing was true in Iran when the forces defected from the Shah, Somoza, Nicaragua, and I think this gets to that great resistance figure, Václav Havel, and I covered the Velvet Revolution. I was in the Magic Lantern Theater every night with Havel, who wasn't a particularly gifted speaker, of course a brilliant writer. He wasn't a particularly charismatic, but he had that moral authority of having resisted since the founding of Charter 77. And when they walked out into the streets, the foot soldiers of the elite would not use force and coercion to crush those movements, and those regimes are finished. And I think that if you read Havel's 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, that he calls Living in Truth, I think, as I mentioned at the top of this talk, there is a truth about what's happened to this country, about the destruction of our democracy, about the theft of all of our institutions by the most rapacious and retrograde forces of corporate capitalism. That truth is there. But it's not going to be amplified and it's not going to be heard unless we stand up and make it heard. And I think the state is terrified of that truth, in the same way that they were terrified of the truth that Havel spoke so courageously throughout all of his life, in and out of jail, a non-person, none of his plays or essays ever published, and yet when that Velvet Revolution came, that country knew who to turn to, because he had stood fast, that moral imperative of revolt. And we are at that moment in history. And that moment is essentially waiting for us. It is waiting for us to stand up with nonviolence and speak that truth. And if we can do it in time, we might not only save the United States, but we might save the planet. But finally, to end, revolt is, in moments of extremity, of what Kant or Hannah Arendt, who uses Kant's term, would call a moment of radical evil, is a moral imperative. And that finally we're called to revolt and stand up and resist, not for what we can achieve, but for who we become. And in a sense, it's an act of faith, and I say this to people of creeds or no creeds, the faith that the good draws to it the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it. And then, of course, we have to let it go. Faith is the belief that it goes somewhere. The Buddhists call it karma. And I think that what Auden calls those ironic points of light, those figures who stand up in moments of extremity and distress and speak that truth, do resonate and can overpower the untruth that lies like a miasma over a society. I was in Wenceslas Square in Prague. 500,000 Czechs were there every night. The walls of that city that winter were covered with posters of a young Charles University student named Jan Palach, who in 1968, to oppose the Soviet invasion of his country, had gone to Wenceslas Square, lit himself on fire, and died 4 days later from his burns. Students from Charles University marched with his corpse, never reported in the state media. The funeral procession was broken up by police. When his grave became a shrine, his body was exhumed, his ashes were given to his mother, and she was not allowed to rebury them. A week after the communist government fell, 10,000 people marched to Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Palach Square. I was in Wenceslas Square when Marta Kubasheva, who in 1968, as the Soviet tanks were rolling in to overthrow Dubček, had gone on the radio to sing an anthem of defiance known as the Prayer for Marta. And once Dubček was overthrown and the pro-Soviet forces were back in power, her entire recording stock was destroyed. She was banned from the airwaves. And in the intervening years, she'd worked on an assembly line at a toy factory. I was there when she walked out on that balcony and began to sing the prayer for Marta. And every Czech in that crowd knew every word. That is the power of resistance. That is the power of living in truth. That is the moral imperative of revolt. And all it requires is for all of us to stand up. Thank you. Okay. We'll just do Q&A. So we'll do a few questions. I'm old. I got to get back and sleep. I got a full day tomorrow. I got to get that, what's it called, the microbus or something? What's it called? Megabus. Anything's better than Amtrak. I'm ready to go. Okay. Oh, do you want to go for the mic? They want you to stand by the mic.
Come on, anybody who wants to ask a question, please just come stand in a line here, and I'll just send you over one by one. Thank you. Right to the mic. Just stand there.
I just wanted to ask you about President Obama. Do you feel that President Obama is really sort of like a figurehead for some corporate banking or group, governmental, some hidden entity, that he came to power promising us in the nation that he was going to do all these things for the common folk, the working classes? He wound up working more for
Right.
the classes that already have.
Well, after Obama was elected, he won Advertising Age's annual award, which is Top Marketer of the Year, because he beat Nike, Apple, Zappos, because the professionals knew just what he'd done. And the tragedy of the 2008 election is that he did have a mandate. But Obama also understood where power lay and that he would never be president if he did not serve those centers of power, which he did.
Thank you so much for your inspirational speech. And I agree so strongly, and this city is a testament that goodness attracts goodness, and there's a lot of exciting things here and hope. But I have to stand here and say today that for others, and especially for the crowd here, I think that large-scale nonviolent direct action could be extremely effective. I think if more people who police aren't used to arresting go and get arrested, it could be very powerful. But for people my age and in general, we don't need a movement. We need to be free. We're all addicted to oil, and to be honest, the entire infrastructure that we live by is not ours. It is just something that is given to us as a dawdle and a plaything to keep us hooked. we need to get free. We need to be able, and I'm not talking about solar panels, because if the only way a solar panel works is that there's oil to rip it out of the ground and ship it here and make it. We need to learn how to catch our own energy from the sun. We need to learn how to farm again. We need to learn how to be happy without a standard of living that could never exist.
Well, there are other people, but I think you're right. And I think that, it is about a radical reconfiguration of how we relate to each other and how we relate to the earth. You're right. And as long as we remain trapped in this consumer paradise, we're just tying the noose around our neck. I'm with Benda. I'm a kind of anarchist. I think power is always the problem. And Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies writes that the question is not how do you get good people to rule. That, Popper says, is the wrong question. He said most people who are attracted to power are at best mediocre or venal. The question is how do you make the power elite frightened of you? And that's Zinn in the people's history of the United States. So our last liberal president was Nixon, not because he was a liberal or because he had a conscience, but because he was frightened of movements. And there's a moment in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where they're standing at a window, it's like 1971 or something, and Nixon's taken buses, city buses end to end, as a barricade all around the White House, and he's wringing his hands going, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's just where we want people in power to be. That's our job. It's not our job to take power. That's what we forgot. It's not our job to take power. It's our job to build powerful movements that hold fast to moral imperatives that hold power in check. That's our job.
Chris, again, thanks very much. We appreciate your work. Most of the situations you mentioned in your address tonight were regional or within a country. What do you see as maybe one of the last nails in the coffin when you've got the implications of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its sister in Europe?
Right, CAFTA. Look, I mean, this is a classic example of how we don't live in a democratic system. Even elected representatives are told they, the insanity of this, they go into the room and they can't take notes, or if they take notes, they have to turn them over. I mean, you would think this was the blueprint for finishing off ISIS, Al-Qaeda, but of course they don't, because it is a further weakening of the nation state, a further ability on the part of corporate predators to prey upon us, especially the working class, which is driving labor down essentially to the level of serfdom. And Obama has been pushing this as hard as he can. So that's just one more symptom of the fact that we do not live in a functioning democracy. We live in what Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism or corporate totalitarianism. And these people are dangerous.
Hi, I wanted to bring out that there's hardly a difference between somebody who says they're taxed enough already or versus somebody who's had their food stamps reduced. I think when we eliminate sectors of the population from legitimacy, we're cutting the effectiveness of a group voice. I personally think that there have been actions on the part of the right, in particular the Bundy Ranch, where you had two well-armed forces. There were probably paid mercenaries at that situation, and there was a restraint of trigger pulling.
Right, well, but that gets to my point of vigilante violence. These were white men with guns. And imagine if everybody showing up at the Bundy Ranch was black. Or imagine if it was Earth First. They would have sent the 82nd Airborne in there, So there has always been a kind of tacit alliance between largely racist white vigilantes and the state going back to the times of slavery. And Because what happens in a system of totalitarianism is that those vigilante groups carry out the excesses. You saw it under Nazism with the brown shirts. Hitler comes to power in 1933. He's trying to woo the German public to his policies of repression and anti-Semitism. And so the brown shirts are sort of beyond my control. And even there were moments when Hitler would apologize for the brown shirts. That's the function of vigilante groups. Because they are ostensibly not part of the state structure, and yet they have been integral in American history to repression against minorities, oppressed, dissidents, union agitators, radicals, communists. The violence, the worst violence, has largely been carried out. Ludlow were carried out by vigilantes. And that's why all these idiots can go up there with their weapons on the Bundy Ranch and essentially walk away. It's because they're white and they're male. Well, we get into white male supremacy.
Chris, thank you for your work. I want to ask you, do you know anything about this document, the Learned Elders of...
What is it?
The Learned Elders of Zion?
The Protocols of the
Yeah,
Elders?
the protocol.
Yeah, it's a forgery created by the Tsar to justify pogroms against Jews. Yeah, bullshit.
Hi, it's an honor. I do a lot of work with dismantling oppressive systems, and you were talking about computers and phones, and I was thinking about how widely spread information is now, whereas the most effective work seems to be done personally on a one-on-one level, and just like your thoughts on the topic.
Well, you're right. I mean, if you're sitting alone in your room in front of your Facebook page writing angry diatribes about corporate capitalism, you're still sitting alone in your room, which is just where corporate capitalism wants you to be. Where they don't want you to be is in a room like this, building a communal structure. And that's the only way. I mean, it's only going to be by walking out into the street together. And I mean, I'm empowered by this stuff. I'm empowered by teaching in that prison. I walk in that classroom, and the level of political sophistication among my students dwarfs anything. I've taught at Princeton. I've taught at Columbia. It dwarfs any of those schools. Those people have such a sophisticated understanding of power, the nature of injustice, corporate capitalism, because of course they're preyed upon inside that system, and so are their families. Yeah, I think the internet and those kind of social media and all, it's great to tell you where to be at what time, but it's as crippling as it is empowering, because we have to come together. And that's what Zuccotti did. And it was one of the things after the NYPD destroyed Zuccotti, we had the People's Library with 5,000 books, and as an act of just kind of wanton cruelty, they threw those books under big garbage trucks and drove over them to destroy them. And in the weeks after, I found the people that I would speak to, the thing they mourned the most was that library. It was organized by retired New York City school librarians. Because what it was is we were recreating a community, a language. We were beginning to share ideas. We were beginning to speak with each other. Where's the guy who we were arrested in front of the White House? What's your name? Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree with me. It was deeply moving. Yes. So there we are in the snow. We didn't stop the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't think we were going to stop the wars. Watermelon Slim plays taps on his harmonica, Vietnam vet. They fold a flag from a kid who'd just been killed in Afghanistan. 132, mostly vets in their uniforms, line up, completely silent in the snow. Someone's beating a drum. And they walk to the fence and are arrested. That's my church. And when a lot of us were cuffed, including myself, it turns out those cops were in the National Guard and they were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they would whisper, "Keep protesting the wars." And you can be sure the state is terrified. And that's why nonviolent resistance is so important, because it speaks to what is best among us, even what is best among those who are tasked with carrying out control for the state. And it is Havel's living in truth. And so those moments, marching on Goldman Sachs, and I've long ago given up trying to look hip, and so I look like this, and I'm marching off to Goldman Sachs. Cornel West and I had just held a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs. We're marching off to block the entrance. There's a picture of us walking towards Goldman Sachs, and I'm in the middle, and everybody around me is pierced, tattooed, with mohawks, and I have my Brooks Brothers button-down shirt. But boy, I'll tell you, that's where my hope lies, is with those kids. They get it, and they were out there, and they were on that street, and they were struggling, and they were paying homage to voices that they knew the wider society had excluded. And we can criticize Occupy as we can criticize anything. But it was a seismic event in American history. That Occupy movement, which was a tactic, has spread its tentacles into Black Lives Matter, into Jet Jubilee, into the attempt to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And if the state thinks that these people have gone away, then they're very naive and very stupid.
I thought your vision of revolution was very interesting, but it also seemed very general. Do you have any more specific vision about how such a thing would start, how it would expand, how it would reach the goals you're looking for?
The day after the climate change march, about 4,000, I was there, went down to Battery Park for Flood Wall Street. Now, what we did on Flood Wall Street is unlike the climate change march, which kept within the police barricades. Look, there are streets. It's not their streets. It's not their streets. They can't tell us where to go on our streets. They can try, and they can make it painful for us, but we can't let them. And Flood Wall Street, without a permit, walked onto those streets. And we didn't know, if it was Bloomberg, we wouldn't have gotten a block. We didn't know what de Blasio was going to do. But we walked onto those streets, and we shut that street down in front of the stock exchange for the day. And that's what we got to start doing, but not just one day. We got to start crippling the entire system. Sustained acts of mass civil disobedience. This is what happened in Europe. Once you start pulling 500,000 people, they start getting scared. And I know, because I unfortunately have family members on Wall Street, and in real time, all through Occupy, they were getting tweets every few minutes. They have puppets. They're going down the street. Oh, they're turning on Bond Street. Oh, they have and so all the titans of the universe were like eating lunch at their desk and not going outside. I mean, Occupy was basically white, college-educated, dumpster-diving kids who do yoga. And I know, because my family's got connected, that they were really, really frightened. Because they thought they'd been found out. Because nobody knows how corrupt the system is. I mean, or the people who most know how corrupt are them. They know how rotten it is. And they are cynical, and they are looting as much, as fast as they can on the way down. And it's all about greed. If I hear Obama give me another speech about education, I mean, the people who got us into this mess are the best educated people in the country. Larry Summers. The problem is greed. And internally, the system itself has no esprit de corps, it's rotten. It's rotten in every single way, including ideologically. And those New York City cops who get $37 an hour to stand in the lobbies and watch these guys go by in their $8,000 suits, they know how rotten it is. The system is very fragile. Systems that collapse instantly. The monolith, it appears, the superstructure appears intact, but it is exactly what Berkman or Gramsci wrote about. The ideological underpinnings, the will to power, all of that is being sucked out of this system, which means it's actually very weak. And that's why it keeps resorting to force, because it doesn't have anything else.
Hi. So you've said a lot about how citizens can reclaim power within the United States. I'm wondering, when it comes to foreign affairs, clearly the U.S. government has a lot of coercive influence all over the world. But a lot of commentators have suggested that that is in decline. And one example I've seen is the fact that there's now a China-based infrastructure bank that a lot of U.S. allies are joining, even though the U.S. forbid them from doing it. And so what I'm wondering is, do you think that U.S. foreign coercive influence is actually in decline, or do you think that's still largely in the future?
We're dying the way all empires die. We're expanding beyond our ability to sustain ourselves. We've lost the war in Iraq. Iraq as a unified country is never coming back. I mean, everybody kept saying, what's worse than Saddam Hussein? You know what's worse? ISIS. We've lost Afghanistan. It's over. We've lost those wars, and we squandered, what's it up to, $7 trillion? Imagine if we had spent that on green energy, alternative energy, the real crisis that faces the planet. And this is how empires die. They're led by idiots like Dick Cheney, or a military establishment. I mean, the most dangerous institution in America is the military-industrial complex, which is killing us all. You're not allowed, by the way, to measure carbon emissions from the military. Yeah, it's not measured. And we have squandered resources we should have spent saving ourselves on utterly futile, illegal wars. Preemptive war under post-Nuremberg laws is a criminal act of aggression. And that, unfortunately, is what happens when elites seize control, because the fact is the population doesn't want the wars. But who wants the wars? Raytheon, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman, because it's, as Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. And they're making a fortune off it. They don't care how many, that's why they want to bomb Syria. Because every cruise missile is another $1 million. They don't care how many Iraqis or Afghanis, even Americans, they don't care how many die. Their stocks have quadrupled since 9/11, and they'll just keep it going. And that's the only reason these is the longest wars in U.S. history. It's the only reason they're still going on. There's this cabal is making big money at it, and it's our money. So get rid of them. Thanks.
So.